DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid.
And RNA, its messenger byproducts, which would be ribonucleic acid, basically. Those two are essentially differing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're the same but different because RNA is a messenger to the rest of the cell, while DNA is the, let's say, control center of all the information.
And the main difference between them is that DNA is double strand.
Right.
RNA is a single strand.
RNA is single-stranded, and so let's say that DNA, they use thymine in the AT pairing, and then they also have cytosine and guanine in their CG pairing. But let's say RNA, they also use different pairings, like they'll have adenine and uracil rather than adenine and thymine, and then cytosine and guanine will remain the same, but that's for transportation purposes, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
So the functionality wouldn't be the same with thymine in its place.
And that could also lead to why the DNA is a lot more stable, because each of those nucleotides have their own chosen and selective nucleotide to pair up with, because adenine and thymine come up in double hydrogen bonds, while cytosine and guanine come up in triples.
Right.
Which also comes to show that DNA lives forever.
Right, I mean, DNA lives forever, it doesn't die off, which is definitely something we need to look into more, because RNA does die off eventually, but DNA doesn't die off, and figuring out why would be a huge help in the aspect of figuring out how evolution works, because as the DNA never dies off, we'll be able to observe it more and more and more,
and even
figuring out exactly how it functions in that way.
Yeah, and even knowing that the DNA doesn't die off, it already gives us tons of information to base off of, which allows us to figure out the genetic makeup of a bunch of other already extinct species.
Right. Speaking of extinct species, so there have been a lot of experiments that have been happening in large scientific communities that are definitely more well known, based around cancer research and trying to alter DNA in order to fix those kinds of things, like with CRISPR-Cas. Or let's say there are other experiments where they're trying to bring back, let's say, extinct species, like they're trying to recreate a small dinosaur for now, and then they'll probably move to the larger ones later. And then also there's Dolly the sheep, who was cloned in recent years, and that was the first ever cloned sheep that was absolutely successful. And they actually got a living, breathing organism out of that.
And coming to think that even though everything about that living organism, that sheep Dolly, was exactly the same in the counterpart, they're still technically different because the environment is also what affects the DNA.
Right, exactly. It's similar to twins, how like the twins, they'll usually have about 90% or even more genetic makeup being the same, but then their environment will change their personalities entirely, and they'll also have minor differences affected physically by that environment as well.
And that's also what causes their different personality traits.
Right.
As you can see, most of these twins in shown TV shows all look the same, and mostly they're not fraternal, they're identical.
Yeah, typically.
They look the same, but they have completely different personality traits.
Right, and they try to show the irony of it in those shows, but that kind of relates to real life too, because it's so ironic how they can be so similar yet so different, because genetic makeup doesn't really change who you are as a person, but rather who you are physically. And then it also makes it easier to, let's say, get relative comparison for genetics, in the sense that siblings are related to each other, and should that ever come in handy, the DNA would match in that sense, like we were talking in gel electrophoresis.